Hey there, it's Carlo here from AYCB, and today I'm going to be showing you how to play Valknut, which is a modern take on Hnefatafl, which is an ancient game that was sometimes referred to as Viking chess. So Valknut is basically an asymmetric skirmish game, mostly intended for 2 players, but it can go up to 4 players. I say it's asymmetric because each player has a unique faction or warband that they're playing as. And it's also considered a skirmish game because that's basically a small back and forth battle, and a round of Vulcanut usually takes about 10 or 15 minutes. So the goal of the game here is basically to eliminate all of your opponent's pieces, or to have the strongest army remaining at the end of the game when the last terrain card is placed. So stick around and let me show you how to play. We've removed all the cards with the 3s and 4s on them for higher player counts, as well as the Bifrost card here, then shuffle the remaining 13 double-sided terrain cards to form the deck. Each player chooses a warband. For this matchup, we'll go with the Vikings against the Draugr. I'll go over each of the warbands in detail at the end of the video, but for now the main thing to note is just that each warband has a different number of units, as well as a unique ambush card, which we'll show you a bit later. Now take one card randomly from the terrain deck as the starting card, with this numbers side face up, to form the parley area. At this point, the top 3 cards are revealed from the top of the terrain deck. Then players place anywhere from 1 to 4 of their units in that parley area. The player whose faction has fewer units goes first. Each player's remaining pieces stay in the general supply and may enter play later. In Valknut, all pieces move like a rook in chess. They can go any number of spaces in a straight line to the left, right, forward, or back, but never diagonally. The only thing forcing a unit to stop its movement would be if it reaches a terrain type that it cannot cross. More on the terrain types right away. On your turn, you start by replenishing the terrain card pool to 3 cards if there are not 3 available. Then you simply choose one of those, add it to the battlefield orthogonally adjacent to any previous card. The card can be rotated 180 degrees, but not 90 degrees, as all sides must line up evenly. Let's say the Viking player places this card here. These spots represent the most basic terrain type, grassland. There are also forests, rivers, and mountains, and only certain warbands can cross those terrain types. You'll also notice these cards have a number in the middle. This number represents movement points, meaning this is how many moves you get after placing the card. In this case, with 2 moves, I could either move the same piece twice, like this, or I can split that into 1 move each for 2 separate pieces, like this. If a player places a card with this Valknut symbol here, that player also spawns a new unit from their supply onto that symbol before resolving the movement value on the card. A unit may move the same turn it enters play. Either way, movement points are always optional. If a player places a Valknut symbol but has no units to place from their supply, they get 1 extra movement point that turn. Also keep in mind, your units can never move through other units of yours or enemies, aside from certain warbands that can move through enemy units. And even if your warband can cross a specific terrain type, each unit in the game must end its movement on grassland at all times. Once you've moved, if you haven't flanked any enemy units, your turn is over. To flank a unit means simply to end your movement in a way that one of your opponent's units is sandwiched or flanked by either your own units and or uncrossable terrain. For example, I can flank my opponent's enemy units with either 2 of my own units, like this, or between my unit and the terrain, like this. After each movement point you resolve, check to see if any enemy units are flanked. Flanked enemies are killed. Remove them from the battlefield and return them to the player's supply. That unit is now part of the player's supply that can be used to enter play once again through the Valknut symbols later on. One other thing to note about flanking is that your own units can never be killed on your own turn, but if you leave your units flanked by enemy units at the end of your turn, then at the start of your opponent's turn they'll just be killed immediately. Anyway, now's a good time to go over all the 9 warbands and what they do. Each warband has a unique number of units, a unique point value on each of those units, and a unique ability. Some warbands can even cross certain terrain types, but most can only move on grassland. Let's start with the warband with the most units and work our way down to the one with the fewest. First off, there are 9 goblins, each worth 1 point. Every time you place a card with a Valknut symbol, you may place a goblin on each unoccupied Valknut symbol on the entire battlefield. If you don't have any goblins left, you get +1 movement point for each missing goblin. There are 8 Draugr, each worth 2 points. When you kill an enemy unit, it immediately becomes a Draugr. This could result in a chain reaction where a newly spawned Draugr immediately flanks an enemy. If you don't have any Draugr left, you get +1 movement point. And there are, of course, 7 dwarves, each worth 2 points. In addition to grassland, dwarves can cross mountains. Whenever you place any terrain card, get +1 movement point. There are 6 dragons, each worth 2 points. You may spend 1 movement point to teleport a dragon on the battlefield to an unoccupied Valknut symbol. There are 5 Vanir, each worth 3 points. Vanir can cross rivers. You may spend 1 movement point to push an adjacent enemy, along with your own, 1 space forward. There are 4 Vikings, each worth 3 points. When killing an enemy unit, you immediately lose all remaining movement points. Then, if you'd like, you may place a new terrain card from the available options and resolve it as normal with the movement point value of the new card. Keep in mind the terrain pool only refills at the start of the next player's turn. There are 3 elves, each worth 4 points. Elves can cross forests. Plus, they can flank units even if they are up to 2 spaces away. There can only be grasslands and or forests between your unit and the enemy in order to kill them. There are 2 Valkyries, each worth 5 points. Valkyries can cross all terrain types and even move through enemy units. Gain +1 movement point each time you kill an enemy unit. And finally, there is only 1 Ice Giantess, worth 6 points on her regular side and 9 points on the enraged side. She can cross all terrain types and move through enemy units. You'll notice her unit token takes up 2 full spaces instead of 1. She must be flanked twice, in other words surrounded by 4 spaces worth of terrain and enemy units, like this, in order to be killed. As long as there are 3 or more Valknut symbols visible in the battlefield, flip the Ice Giantess over to her enraged side. While enraged, she can kill enemy units by placing the Ice Giantess on top of them to stomp them. If ever there are no longer 3 Valknut symbols uncovered, flip the Ice Giantess back over to her regular side. So that's all 9 warbands. Another thing to keep in mind about your turn is just that if ever you'd like, instead of placing one of the terrain cards from the pool here, you can instead place as a one-time thing your ambush card. Each faction or warband starts with one of these. You can place this on your turn instead, in which case you would then remove one of these 3 cards from play so that you're not changing the speed of the game or how many cards are left in the deck. These ambush cards look just like the other terrain cards, but they're specifically created in ways that help each particular warband. So players just continue taking turns back and forth, either until one player has eliminated all their opponent's pieces off the board, or until all 13 of these terrain cards have been placed, in which case we just add up the points remaining on the pieces on the board and see who has the most points left, and that player wins. If the players are tied on points, then the tiebreaker is the player whose warband has the maximum number of units, as each of those units is worth less. Just note that only units outside the parley area, which are that starting card, count toward this final score. This is reflected here on the parley card itself, showing that units left here are worth 0 if the game goes the full distance. You might still have the odd question or two that comes up, but if so, there's a really helpful FAQ section in the back of the rulebook that tends to clear up mostly everything. If you still have any questions, feel free to leave a comment below and I'll try and get to it as soon as I can. And just remember, every time you play Valknut, there's going to be a different set of order that these cards come out, and you're going to have different matchups, so there's always going to be a new challenge figuring out which terrain cards to place where, depending on what your faction's strengths are. As I mentioned at the start, you can also play this with 3 or 4 players, which just requires a small change to the setup, which you can find in the rules. There's also a variant in the rulebook called Ragnarok mode, where each player plays with 2 warbands at once. The Kickstarter version I got also comes with a mini expansion called Gods and Monsters, which adds a separate pool of cards with these special Gjallarhorn icons that let players perform additional abilities when adding a card with that icon to the battlefield. I won't go over the expansion in detail as the rulebook covers it in a single page. I'll just end by saying that I had hoped to initially do a full review of this game, but due to just countless setbacks from the pandemic, I don't think I'll be able to do a full review. However, we are hoping to start a series at some point, doing a bunch of little mini reviews for small box games like this, so hopefully if we do that, there's a good chance Valknut will be featured in one of those in the future. Otherwise, that's all I got for now. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing and or telling a friend. Otherwise, that's it for now, and I'll see you around.